This project is going to deal with subtractive sculpture methods. Now, so far we've been using what are called additive processes. So additive sculpture is when you are adding a material to itself or another material to make a sculpture. So we've been adding cardboard to build up a form, or wire to wire to build up a form. The difference is that with subtractive sculpture, we are taking away material to create a form. So we have two examples here. Viola Frey is a ceramic artist, and if you look closely, you can see the way she built up the ceramic or the clay to create this sculpture. Whereas Edmonia Lewis sculpted this figure out of a block of marble. So here's a little overview of the process of subtractive sculpture. You can use a lot of different materials. In this case, this artist, Kanamaki, is using, you can see here, a big trunk of a tree. So he is making subtractive sculpture from wood. And so you can see how he starts with the trunk of the tree, and then he starts blocking it out. So he's removing material from the tree to open up these planes where you can see in the third photograph, he's sketched on the figure based on his smaller model. Then he continues to remove material from the tree trunk, slowly carving the primary contours, and then in the second photo you can see he's getting to the secondary contours of his sculpture. And then finally he starts refining his forms. So if you look at this close-up of the heads, you can see how on the left, the heads are becoming a lot more refined, the features are more detailed, whereas with the faces towards the right, they're still very blocky, and you can see the process of how he's slowly taking away material and bringing out this form. And then in this last photo on the right here, you can see he's really gone into detail with the textures and faces. So subtractive sculpture is a technique that has a very long history in art. So this Venus of Willendorf statue is a small limestone sculpture that was made using a subtractive method, and you can see it was the estimated date is 30,000 BCE. So this is a really, really old way of making objects. And it's been used, subtractive sculpture has been used throughout the world. We find examples on every continent of people making art using these techniques. And they do use a variety of different materials. Here we see jade and basalt, which are both types of stone. The hacha of a bird head is Mayan, which is from an area in Mexico. And this sculpture of Lalita is from India. And if we continue looking around the world, we see an example of a subtractive wood sculpture from Africa and a very well-known marble sculpture from Europe. So let's take a closer look at some artist examples and see how artists were using subtractive sculpture. Here we have Alan Hauser, who is a Native American artist who is well known for his sculptures, paintings, and illustrations. Here are some of his earlier sculptures, and you can see he's taking a very geometric approach to them. This small one on the left was used, if you look closely, you can see some of the faces are numbered, and it was used as a small model for enlarging on a bigger scale. But it's plaster, so he was using this method of removing material from a plaster block to create this geometric form. And I included his sculpture on the right because I think it's a really great example of negative space and using negative space to create a very dynamic, complex sculpture. Here are some more works by Alan Hauser, and again, you can see how negative space is coming into play here. These sculptures are a little more organic, a little, they're much more rounded than the first two sculptures that I showed you. But you can continue to see how he's thinking about negative space and the holes and curves and the way forms are meeting each other. And he's very well known for the style of sculpture in that third image, Reverie. Another artist example is Barbara Hepworth. Actually, it's Dame Barbara Hepworth. She's an English sculptor who is very well known for her work with subtractive techniques. Here we see Mother and Child, which is one of her first really famous works, and that's made out of a type of limestone, I believe, stone, some sort of stone. But anyway, you can see how we're starting to see these really curvy, organic forms with a lot of negative space. And she's thinking about, this is actually two forms, so you can kind of see there's the larger sculpture on the base, and then kind of on the right towards the top, there's a smaller form resting on it. And so she's really thinking about the relationship and overall composition of these two forms. And then Child with Mother, so a variation on the theme. On the right, again, you see her thinking about two forms in one composition, and she's using negative space here, but she's also using repetition of this sort of oval kind of form to help unify these objects. Here are some examples of her wood sculptures, and you can see how she's really kind of thinking about the interior of the sculpture here, and really taking advantage of the surface of the wood and contrasting that with the white paint on the inside to draw your attention to how she's using space to create these interesting sculptures. So your project is going to be using subtractive sculpting techniques on bars of soap. For this project, you're going to create an abstract sculpture from solid blocks of soap using subtractive carving. You're going to begin, of course, with sketching and then continue on to carving away on the soap to block in the major forms. Then you're going to refine the textures, or refine the forms and add texture to complete a freestanding sculptural composition with at least two objects in it. So if you think about Barbara Hepworth's early sculptures of Mother and Child, where she had two objects in one sculpture relating to each other, you're going to be working similarly. So these objects should interact or relate to each other through an arrangement that makes use of positive and negative space. So important vocabulary for this project includes, of course, shape, form, volume, and plane, which we've talked about with your previous projects. For this project, we're introducing this idea of subtractive sculpture, so the technique of removing material to construct a sculpture. We're talking about positive and negative space. So positive space is the area a three-dimensional object occupies. And negative space refers to the area around or between three-dimensional objects. You can also use it to describe a void within an object. We're also going to be really highlighting your use of texture here, which is the visual or tactile quality of the surface. And then, of course, we're continuing to think about making dynamic sculptures that use movement and emphasis, and unity too between the two forms. And remember, you can create a sense of unity, or which is like the sense of cohesion or oneness of the two objects, like that they're meant to work together. And you can do this through techniques like continuity. So there's like a line or form that continues from one object to the other. You can do this through proximity and how close they are to each other. And you could also do this through repetition. So if you repeat a form or pattern or texture from one object to the other. Balance is also going to become an important part of this project, especially if these two objects are going to be touching. They're going to need to have some sort of visual balance, whether that's asymmetrical or symmetrical, maybe even radial. That might be a little trickier though. And then of course, we're making abstract forms here. So that means that there's a certain degree of independence from visual reality. So you can be inspired by things that exist in the world, but I'm not going to recommend that you try to subtractively sculpt something realistic looking. I'm going to recommend that you rely instead on formal elements like shape and form and texture to achieve the artistic effects. So we're really focusing on how might your artistic process change according to the materials you're using. How is sculpting subtractively requiring a different sort of thought process and consideration from you? And then also thinking about how artists use space as part of a sculpture. Space is going to be very inherent to this project, both in that you have two objects that are separate and taking up different space, right? But you want them to be unified. And so that can be in how you use space and how you engage with the negative space that might be between the objects. So our objectives here are to use carving techniques intentionally to remove material for a desired effect, to understand the varied approaches that exist to sculptural materials, to understand the relationship between positive and negative space, to make a sculptural composition that has at least two object elements sculpted from two different soap blocks. If you want to include more, if you want to include 3, sure, you can do that. But at the very least, you're going to have two objects relating to each other. You're going to be designing and creating textures that help contribute to this composition. And hopefully in a way that uses balance and movement to make a sculpture that engages with space. And then, of course, we want these sculptures to have high craftsmanship and attention to detail. So here's the rubric. You can see you'll be evaluated on your use of 2 different objects from 2 different soap blocks, that your sculpture is using movement, emphasis, and unity, and that you're creatively engaging with negative and positive space. We're going to be looking at if your sculpture has a dynamic composition and establishes a clear relationship between the objects in the composition. We're looking at your craftsmanship, and then of course your artist statement and documentation. So the materials you'll need for this project are a sketchbook and a pencil, the 2 bars of soap that came in your materials kit, and if you have an extra one, it might be nice to practice on it. The carving tools that came in your material kit, and you also might want to find some other tools that could be helpful, like for example, you'll see me using a butter knife. If you might use an X-Acto knife or your box cutter, toothpicks or skewers can be helpful for making texture. I don't know, screwdriver, if you have any other like clay tools, wax carving tools, anything you might think could work, grab it and test it and see what it does. I found it helpful to use a sponge when smoothing. A rag might be useful if you don't have a sponge, like a small bowl of water, a spray bottle to help get your fingers a little bit wet. That might help with smoothing. Um, it's a good idea to use safety mats to protect your eyes. I don't think you'll be getting too crazy, but I would hate for you to get soap in your eyes. And then, of course, if you're working on a surface that you don't want to potentially damage with carving tools or something like that, put down a mat or something to help protect your work surface and collect shavings. So the process is going to go a little like this. We're going to start by sketching out 3 different ideas, and for each idea you need to show 4 different angles. And then once you're sure what idea you want to make, you're going to begin by plotting out the primary contours of your sculpture on the bar of soap. Then you'll start using your tools to block out the major forms. That means you're going to start removing materials and trying to establish the major form and primary contours of your sculpture. Then you'll go in and start refining those secondary contours and refining the tool marks and things like that. And then you'll start adding texture. So that might be using your sponge to smooth it or a tool to carve some texture in. And then remember, along the way, you're going to be updating your process portfolio and then, of course, your final documentation. And after that, we will have our critique. Here's an overview of the calendar for this project. We are going to be working again with a 3-week process. So that's 2 weeks of making and 1 week of critiquing. So just like the project before this, it's going to be a similar pace. And you can see that the first week you'll have sketches due and a process portfolio update due. The next week you'll have your process portfolio, a second process portfolio update due. And then the third week your final documentation and critiques are due. Now let's get to work.